Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. We post these conversations on average once a week as part of the larger mission of the Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine. We are a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization devoted to promoting science and reason, and we depend upon and appreciate your support. So if you find this podcast valuable, along with our magazine and other projects we work on, please support us at skeptic.com/donate. There you can support our work through one-time and recurring donations via PayPal, monthly donations via Patreon, a direct donation via Shop Skeptic, by check in the mail, and even old school by phone. To that end, I want to thank everybody who donated to our annual fundraising drive for 2018. Some donations are still coming in. Thank you. Which we depend upon to meet our annual budget in support of our many science education projects. My next guest is Dr. Tyler Cohen, a Harvard-trained economist who is an economics professor at George Mason University, where he holds the Holbert C. Harris Chair in the Economics Department. He hosts the economics blog Marginal Revolution, together with co-author Alex Tabarrok, and he writes the Economic Scene column for the New York Times and now contributes a regular opinion column at Bloomberg View. He has written for the New Republic, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Newsweek, and the Wilson Quarterly. He has a new book coming out in April called Big Business, a love letter to a forgotten hero of the American culture scene. But his new book that's just out now, Stubborn Attachments, a vision for a society of free, prosperous, and responsible individuals. In this blog, we discuss what it means to be on the margin or marginal utility and what his blog, Marginal Revolution, is all about. Where does that name come from? What does it mean? Trade wars and tariffs and what they really mean for consumers, companies, and countries like China, the NAFTA agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, etc. Unemployment is now under 4%, the lowest in decades. So does this mean Trump is a savvy economist? Spoiler alert, he doesn't think so. Why capitalism is a moral system as well as an economic system. Income inequality and universal basic income. Regulating financial markets. Regulating social media companies. Immigration. How does an economist think about borders and walls? Why incentives matter, and the related concept libertarian paternalism and why nudging people to do the right thing can be difficult. Jordan Peterson and the power of narrative, and kind of wrap it up there talking about the big narrative stories, and I ask him what he would recommend Democrats do in 2020 to tell a sellable story, a good narrative story that's better than the one Trump sells. And then finally, I ask him about governing Mars, which may be my next big project. That is, what political and economic system should we take with us to the red planet from here, the blue planet, and which one should we leave behind? I began this podcast by reading a famous quote from John Maynard Keynes' 1936 book, The General Theory of Interest, Employment, and Money, from the concluding remarks of that book, which has become quite famous. I'll read it here again as it bears repeating. In terms of the larger picture of what we're doing, the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. I am sure that the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas. Not indeed immediately, but after a certain interval. For in the field of economic and political philosophy, there are not many who are influenced by new theories after they are 25 or 30 years of age. So that the ideas which civil servants and politicians and even agitators apply to current events are not likely to be the newest. But, soon or late, it is ideas not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. I think that bears some light on what it is that those of us who traffic in ideas and the power of beliefs are doing. So with that, here is Dr. Tyler Cohen. Okay, we are good to go. Sounded good, and thank you for being on the show, Tyler. I will have already introduced you to our audience, but let me make a note in addition here to your the impetus for this dialogue is your new book, Stubborn Attachments. And but before we dive into that, which I definitely want to get into the weeds with you on these economic matters, for those of our listeners and viewers who are not familiar with your work, give us a little background of where you're born and raised and how you got into economics. Your work is infused with social psychology and philosophy and lots of different fields. How did you end up choosing economics and doing what you're doing now?
I'm an economist. I've been teaching at George Mason University almost 30 years. I was born and grew up in New Jersey. And when I was 14 years old, I decided I wanted to try to read as much as possible, which started with economics and philosophy, but went pretty far afield. And so that was a long time ago, and I've just been at it, and I keep on trying to double down on that. And in a nutshell, that's like my life.
That's a pretty good potted biography. Yeah, you do seem pretty well read in philosophy and not just the ancients, but also current philosophical debates about utilitarianism, for example, and consequentialism, and that kind of thing. So obviously, you do have some background. At least personally, you've been reading a lot, if not professionally trained.
That's right. I've done a lot of publishing in philosophy journals, also, though more in economics. And it's a very good way of thinking that more people should invest in. Peter Thiel is an example of someone who earlier on was trained as a philosopher.
Oh, yes. I've just gotten to know Peter. He is really quite an interesting guy. I had no idea he was so well read in philosophy. And he's one of those super smart guys that's pretty much an autodidact outside of what it seems like what he does for a living. So I think that's kind of the new wave. Of the third culture.
He's an autodidact, but he's also great at learning from other people. So the auto and autodidact is typically a tricky word.
Yeah.
There are ways to learn from other people that have nothing to do with the university, and I suppose these kinds of dialogues are one of them.
I do think the future of education in the long run is going to be more and more of this kind of thing, that like the teaching company courses and audiobooks and the Coursera courses and what do they call those MOOC courses? I don't know if they're still popular, but there's just so many avenues for interested minds to access knowledge pretty much for free or close to free. Sure. Now. You don't have to go to a brick and mortar university.
You say the long run, but maybe it's true in the short run. If you add up the number of people who are reading blogs, seriously engaged on Twitter, consuming podcasts and paying attention, and compare it to the number of people sitting in classrooms on a given day paying attention, I'm not sure how those two numbers would turn out, but I think they would be pretty close.
Yeah, we may be there now. I mean, it's true. Just personally, most of the people I follow on Twitter are just either content providers, they produce it, or they just link to interesting articles. And I could sit for hours reading articles in the Atlantic or Vanity Fair, Time, News, whatever. And they're good. I mean, it's high quality stuff. Yeah. And at some point I have to shut it off or else I'm not going to get any work done for the day. But it feels valuable. Like I'm not just, reading People magazine or something. It's like high quality content.
And it's not just that. Often if you engage with people, they'll give you a response. If you email or tweet at someone, you may hear back. So it's quite dialogue oriented, at least if you go about it in a polite way.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to dive in here with probably one of the two or three most famous quotes from an economist. You, of course, know this, but for our listeners who don't, I think this captures a lot. This, of course, from the famous John Maynard Keynes, his 1936 book with possibly the worst book title ever, The General Theory of Interest, Employment, and Money. In his concluding remarks notes, the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. I am sure that the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas. Not indeed immediately, but after a certain interval. For in the field of economic and political philosophy, there are not many who are influenced by new theories after they are 25 or 30 years of age, so that the ideas which civil servants and politicians and even agitators apply to current events are not likely to be the newest. But, soon or late, it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. To me, that just sort of compels us to recognize the importance of studying economics and politics, or political economy, or whatever you want to call it.
I very much agree with that. I think he's exaggerating a bit. So policymakers are also influenced by the religions that surround them, maybe by the movies they've seen, possibly by social media or the evening news. So it's giving too much credit to the academics and economists. But I agree, people overrate how much special interests have to say.
Yes, well, it all comes down to ideas. People act on something; they act on their beliefs. So, if you believe in this religion or that ideology or this economic policy or this political philosophy, that's going to very much determine what you do. So, what we're doing, what you do, especially as a professional economist, is vitally important, because who knows who reads your materials or your blog or watches your videos, and what effects that has.
President Obama used to read us at Marginal Revolution.
Tell us about, to get into the weeds of a little economic theory here, what is marginal utility? Why do you call your blog Marginal Revolution? You talk a lot in the new book about being on the margins. What does that mean, and why is that important?
There was a development in the history of economics in 1871. It's called the Marginal Revolution. It's when people finally figured out how supply and demand and market valuation all fit together in a coherent way. And three researchers came up with it at the same time. And when Alex Tabarrok and I started our economics blog, we thought, well, what should we name this? And we just thought Marginal Revolution. It's a kind of a double meaning. One is it refers to economics for those in the know, but it's also our small attempt to make the world a better place. It's our little marginal revolution. And we like that double meaning. And we thought people would remember it. And in Romance languages, those words more or less translate as is. So it worked.
But economically, being on the margin, what does that mean?
It means that you're always choosing a discrete amount of something from an initial starting point. And you need to ask, what is your starting point and which unit is the marginal unit? So, for instance, market price is determined by how much people already have and how much they're trading for now. When you go back to Adam Smith's paradox, well, why is it that diamonds cost more than water when water keeps you alive and diamonds are but a bauble? Well, if you think you already have plenty of water and at the margin you barely have any diamonds, and a diamond might help you get an engagement ring, then diamonds will have a higher price. That's a super simple example of marginal reasoning.
Yeah, I like how that comes up in a lot of your writings. I was watching one of your videos where you were talking about people are more likely to get divorced after a corporation goes public. And then you explain why,
yes.
why when the stock options become available to sell, you have more money and you can afford a divorce, whereas before maybe not. So you see a little spike right after an IPO. There's all these
IPOs coming to the Bay Area. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, these poor people.
Maybe divorce lawyers should follow those trend lines.
I think they do.
They probably do, even if it's unconsciously. And I should note, parenthetically, that your book, Stubborn Attachments, the new book here, the proceeds for this are going to a young man you met in Ethiopia. I think you're sort of following your Peter Singer's philosophy of putting your money where your mouth is in terms of trying to make the world a better place. But we'll get to that, the relationship between economics and morality in a minute. One of the things I liked about the book is the nice little encapsulated summaries at the start of each chapter, including the start of the book. Growth is good. Throughout history, economic growth in particular has alleviated human misery, improved human happiness and opportunity, and lengthened human lives. Wealthier societies are more stable, offer better living standards, produce better medicines, and ensure greater autonomy, greater fulfillment, and more sources of fun. If we want to sustain our trends of growth and the overwhelmingly positive outcomes for societies that come with it, every individual must become concerned with the welfare of those around us. So there you're not making just an economic observation, you're also making a moral value judgment. It's kind of kind of a proscription for what we should do.
Look at where people wish to migrate is another way to look at it. But there's good evidence that people are happier and more creative and more fulfilled in wealthier societies. And furthermore, wealthier societies are able to do more to help other people. So my giving the proceeds to this fellow in Ethiopia and his family, if I were not in wealthier America, that wouldn't be possible.
Right. So having prosperity, and it opens more doors and gives more opportunities to then shift to thinking about important moral values.
And just innovating for other people, right? Think of all the smartphones in Africa that make African economies more productive. Those come from the United States and other wealthy nations.
As I understand it, a lot of these countries have skipped landline stage and gone straight to cellular
That's right.
phones.
Vaccines, antibiotics. There's so many ways in which wealthier societies do good by the entire world. So I'd like to see more of that. We could do much better yet. We need more economic growth. It's one of the central themes of my book.
Right. You probably know that famous quote from John Adams where he says, I have to study political science, the science of politics, so that my children can study, literature and naval architecture and so on, so that their children can study, I think he said, porcelain and pottery and music or something like that. So without the foundations of basic necessities of life, you can't enjoy the higher goods.
And he did that, of course, and it more or less worked. Though it remains a work in progress, right? You can never stop studying those other things.
Yeah. But here, when I was reading your book, you do like what I do, is cross that Humean divide between is and not. You're in a way you're arguing this is the way the world is. That is, certain political and economic systems work better than others. How do you measure better? Prosperity. Why is prosperity good? Because it opens opportunities and gives people better lives. Why is it better to have more money and a higher quality healthcare system and 3 square meals a day and a roof over your head? Ultimately, why is that better?
Well, look, there's some point in the argument where someone can simply ask you, why is it better to be better, right?
Right.
And there's not actually any final answer. But if that's the weak point of what I'm doing, I'm willing to live with that. I think then that ideal will rule the world if that's its only weakness. So I think everyone believes in a kind of objective ethics. Some of them pretend they don't, but listen to them talk about their colleagues or their children or maybe their in-laws, and it's clear that they do. So I take that as a given, and I start with what do we actually know about human well-being, and then I try to work backwards from that toward this philosophy of boosting economic growth.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think you just have to ask people, where would you rather live? And would you rather be healthy or sick? Would you rather have cancer or no cancer? Would you rather have 3 good square meals a day or 1? And they'll answer. In fact, they do answer behaviorally. They answer with their feet. They want to go to those countries where they have those opportunities and get away from the countries where they don't. That seems to me a kind of objective knowledge that scientists can discover. And therefore, that's how I breach that is-ought barrier.
That's right. So I think a lot of ethics is fairly scientific, in fact. What we know about ethics is in many ways sounder than what we know about string theory or cosmology, and no one doubts that those things are science, right?
Well, string theory, I don't know. Some of my physics friends tell me that it's kind of on the margins of being science.
Yeah, they may be right, but that we don't know.
That's right.
You know more about ethics.
Now, you do say, starting chapter 1, when it comes to the future of our world, we have lost our way in a fundamental manner and not just on a few details. We must return to principles, but we do not always have good principles to guide us. We have strayed from the ideals of a society based on prosperity and rights and liberties of the individual, and we do not know how to return to those ideals. Okay, why is that a problem, and what do we do to get back to those principles?
If you look at politics in the Western world today, while I mostly agree with Steven Pinker, and I see a lot of ongoing progress, I see some signs of retrogression. less interest in classical ideas of liberalism and capitalism and rule of law. Not everywhere, but in more countries than makes me comfortable. And I think we need to go back and re-examine what are the actual foundations of what we believe in regarding capitalism, democracy, and the rule of law. And that's what my book tries to do.
Yeah. Well, I think you do that well. By the way, what do you call yourself when people say, are you a libertarian or classical liberal, conservative, whatever?
Maybe I'm all of those. I might first say I'm a small L libertarian, but I'm conservative and wanting to conserve the best of the Western tradition. I wouldn't call myself a contemporary political conservative. Classical liberal, I'm fine with being called that. I'm not sure exactly what it means. It's a big, diverse thing. And some of the classical liberals, in fact, believed in slavery, right? So there were contradictions in that, too. I'd say small libertarian, but liberal and conservative, eclectic.
Right. But if we want to steel man the other side position, that is, instead of straw manning them, ever since 2008 and the financial meltdown, it seemed pretty apparent that the capitalist system in general, or maybe just the financial industry in particular, was pretty rigged and not producing prosperity for the average person or the little guy. That was really benefiting it's the Matthew effect. To those who have, more shall be given, and all the rest can go to hell. And it really looked like that. So how do you can you kind of sympathize with those who are skeptical of capitalism, particularly after the '08 meltdown?
Well, yes, if you're talking about the United States, if you look at, say, 5 or 10-year weighted, averages of growth rates, those have been declining for some time. So if people are unhappy, they're unhappy in a time of declining economic growth. That, to me, is an argument for higher growth, not an argument against it. I do think we need to reform our economic system in some ways. But I would say if you look at economic growth for the world as a whole, the global growth rate basically has never been higher. It's in the range of 3.5% to 4%. Income inequality for the world as a whole has been going up steadily for decades. So the overall aggregate picture is really very, very positive, and that's often neglected.
I think maybe for most people who don't really think about this, explain how if you have a 2% growth rate and you bump it up to a 3% growth rate, that's not a 1% increase. It's far more than that.
Returns compound. The power of compound returns is one of the most profound human truths. I give an example in the book. From 1890 to 1980, if the U.S. growth rate had been 1 percentage point lower, we would, in 1980, have been like Mexico and not like the U.S. So 1 percentage point means a great deal accumulating over time.
Right. Yeah, I have in the Moral Arc, I have a graph here showing in terms of this income inequality, this sort of breakdown in the percentages since, let's see, I think it was 1979 to 2010 of the bottom fifth, second fifth, middle fifth, fourth fifth, and then this is, the top 20%. So the bottom. That's a great book, by the way, for our listeners. Thank you.
Yes,
thank
go
you.
on.
I mean, the bottom 4/5 of income distribution went up 49%, 37%, 36%, 45%. So they all got richer. But this is what bothers people. The one on the end where, the top, 1% grew 202%. I think we have an evolved psychology where that just doesn't feel right. Even if it's, not logical to feel that way, it still feels wrong.
Well, I think the real growth, income growth in America today, it's not really the top 1%. They're actually getting whacked somewhat with equity markets. But the top, say, 15% have done remarkably well. So people who are well educated have had a great time of it. So there is a lesson there that we can extend education to more and more people. I'm not saying that's easy, but I do think there's a very direct recipe of how we could proceed. And we're mostly failing to do it. So high school graduation rates, if you adjust for how people have fudged the numbers, they're barely up since the late 1960s. That's crazy. We're America. We should be the world's greatest nation. You look at how many people we put in prison, how expensive it is to live in Manhattan or San Francisco, how many trades are regulated by, you need a license to be able to do them at all. The lack of interest in science. I think our government should do much more to support basic science. We've given up on things like nuclear power that are completely green. We've done so much that to me is kind of crazy. And those were own goals. We didn't have to do it. So can we do better by the Americans who are not, doing extraordinarily well? Absolutely, I'm convinced we can.
Yeah, I saw a statistic the other day where the difference between having a high school graduation versus a college graduation of what it does for your income since like the 1970s, and it's just huge. Basically, if you graduated from high school and never went on, your wages are flat since the 1970s. Those that have a college education, it's gone way up. So in part, just those basics. But then I heard another related comment that in whatever year Robert Reich became Clinton's economic advisor, 94, maybe 93. And so some advisors came to him and said, we have all these community colleges. Computers are really the future, and the internet was just starting, and we got to get workers trained in computers. Community colleges are essentially free at the time. And the unions leaned on him to not support that through the Clinton administration because self-trained, computer-savvy workers are not likely to be supportive of unions in the future. So that was rather interesting.
I didn't know about that. I would just say countries as diverse as Finland, South Korea, Singapore, they've improved their education systems a great amount. So it can be done. I'm not saying we should copy them in every way. We're a very different country, but we haven't improved our system much at all. So it's really incumbent on us to make ourselves wealthier, happier, more creative, more peaceful society. Just knowledge, science, education.
So even as a libertarian, you agree that the government has some role in getting its citizens educated up to a certain level to be economically viable in the world.
Yes, but I would say even if you're a pure libertarian, we have the system we have right now. It's not going to disappear overnight. We should have as good a version of it as we possibly can, and it could be much, much better. This country right now has a lot of really good schools. Many of them are in Northern Virginia where I live. We don't have some magic potion that no one else can figure out. It's just a lot of places haven't done it yet.
Right. So how do you bring about that change from the top down? Or is it just a bottom up? Paying teachers a little bit more or recruiting people from industry to go into education or something like that?
I think in our country, it's more bottom up. And of course, we have federalism, but paying good teachers more, being completely willing to fire bad teachers, parents being involved. These are cliches, but they're true cliches, right? They're cliches in part because they're true. It's whether or not you actually do them. So I'm trying to argue there's a kind of civilizational urgency, like a bunch of different things that we think are good, science, better education. It's not just a small amount at stake. It's compound returns for our whole future,
right.
Whether we're 3 or 4 times wealthier and better off than we otherwise might be. That's at stake.
How does an economist think about immigration, since that's the hottest issue in pop culture right now, in politics? Why not open the borders and let all the Mexicans come here, and then when their jobs run out, they'll go back or something like that? Or we live in a world with walls, so we need to build those walls even higher. How do you think about that?
Well, it's a country-specific question, but the United States has a historically quite good record of absorbing and assimilating immigrants. I think we could take in many more people. We could take in many more innovators. There are innovators right now who would love to have green cards and start businesses. They are literally knocking on our door. Companies that would hire them, they would pay taxes and lower budget deficits, which, by the way, we could use to fund the improvement of education. So I would do that. I would significantly boost the quantity of immigrants to the United States. I'm not saying every country can do exactly the same. So if you're a nation such as Israel, which has a very different and particular mission of what it's about, I don't think you can get by with open borders, to say the least. But I think countries like Canada, Australia, the United States, United Kingdom can take in many more people and do well by it.
Could you see a time, sometime perhaps in the distant future, and it seems like we're going in the opposite direction since 2016, rise of populism and authoritarianism and nationalism, when there are no national borders. There's just city-states and economically porous borders, if you want to call them that, and people can move and live and work wherever they want, and it's the city-state that becomes the focus of political organization rather than the nation-state, which is really only a few centuries old in any case.
I can't imagine that easily, but of course someone in the year 1000 could not have imagined where we are now. Big city-states are very useful for defense. The United States, of course, is very powerful. Maybe there's some very distant set of future technologies where cities can perform those functions. I wouldn't rule it out, but I don't think it's around the corner, not anytime even remotely soon. And I think it comes down to some kind of national defense and just protection against enemies through subtler means of surveillance or thwarting terror attacks. Singapore does that pretty well, but I don't think most cities are up to it. And if it were up to Denver, I'd be actually kind of worried. Nothing against Denver, but there are some real scale economies in doing that.
Well, I don't know the Denver reference.
Well, just American cities, I think, much prefer an arrangement where the Pentagon does it for them.
Oh, I see.
Each and every one had to do it on its own. I don't mean to insult Denver. I just don't think they quite have the capabilities to take on Putin and the Chinese and keep them at bay.
Right. Yeah, that's the world we live in, for sure. But also infrastructure. I mean, would the interstate highway system ever be built on by private industry alone?
Probably not, but right now we have a federal government not maintaining a lot of its infrastructure. So if someone is saying we need to look for new recipes, while I don't really have the answers there, I'm very sympathetic to not just feeling, well, we need to go back and do what we did in the 1950s, but we need some new kind of infrastructure, digital infrastructure. The energy infrastructure of the future is not that of the past, and we need to be very forward-looking. I'm not sure the federal government is going to be the one that solves all those problems.
Right, or some balance there, like with space exploration, you have these private industries and NASA.
But the private people have done much better than most had expected, say, 20 years ago. That to me is very heartening. I say, let it rip. Bring it on. Let's have more.
Yeah.
I was surprised.
Totally. I know. There's that great story where Musk traveled to to Moscow, I think, to meet with some rocket people just to see if they had cheaper systems he could just purchase, rather because he couldn't get good prices from American sources. And they were all just hugely inefficient and inordinately expensive. So that's when he decided to found SpaceX and do it himself at a much lower price. So, could that model be extrapolated out for any big project, colonizing Mars or the moon or a future infrastructure system just by private industry?
I don't think we know. I think the potential for that is much higher than we had thought. But it does seem to me there are some public goods, such as, say, pandemic prevention, where I'm not sure if any, one mega billionaire really can get that done on his or her own. So I'm happy to see public and private sector work together in those cases. Bill Gates has done a lot to help develop and distribute vaccines. But he's by no means the main actor there, and we've made enormous progress. So a lot of joint activities where public and private sector compete, I think, is where we're at now. And let's have more and more private sector.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need both, for sure. Remember the speech Obama gave, the "You didn't build it" speech? Where,
that was terrible.
Yeah, conservatives' heads exploded.
Indictment. Yeah.
But on the other hand, what he's talking about is, you have roads to drive on and the country is safe to work in. You don't have to worry about being invaded tomorrow. And you had a good teacher somewhere that was, public school teacher. That's kind of what he's talking about, right? It's the infrastructure that government provides.
That's true. There's still the question, are you going to valorize heroic individual effort and play it up and show it to the public in a very positive way or not? And that was his way of saying, well, not really. I want people to look up to me as president with all the symbols and the eagle and the Oval Office. But when it comes to private business, I'm going to knock them down off their pedestal a bit. And that's terrible.
Oh, I didn't get the sense that was his motive. But
it was in the back of his mind. Like, I never would have said that. Even, like, I make mistakes, but that's not a mistake I ever would have made.
Yeah. Yeah, well, anyway, I don't know. It seems like there's a lot more luck in our lives of how they turn out than it seems at first glance. I mean, where you happen to have been born, United States versus Somalia, for example. You didn't choose that. You got lucky. If your parents, sent you to a quality high school and helped pay for your college or that's good fortune for you. And there's a lot of things like that. Maybe you met a professor as an undergraduate that steered you into economics, and that was kind of a bit of good fortune. Of course, you work hard and take advantage of those opportunities, but there's an element of both there.
I think we should give good mentors much higher status as well. So I would take the collective production quite seriously and look at what are the key other links in that chain. Mentors and quality professors would be some, by no means the only one. And let's distribute more status there too. But not, try to knock down the people who've actually done and contributed something.
Let's look at another one of your chapters here, kind of going through the book, The Overwhelming Benefits of Economic Growth, help us resolve clashing preferences, and thus we are able to overcome what have called the aggregation problem. A higher rate of economic growth, of course, will not make everyone better off. Some individuals living today might be better off with more consumption and less work, and thus in a regime with lower rates of economic growth. And even if economic growth makes many people better off in the long run, it is unlikely to make each and every person better off along the way.
If you look 40, 50 years out in a much wealthier society, almost everyone is better off. Not those people who die because of random accidents, but if you just look at people in their typical roles, almost all of them are better off, say in Canada compared to, Bosnia. And that's the core comparison behind the book. Let's be Canada. Let's be Australia. Let's be, the better functioning parts of the United States.
Which
but
parts
really
are those?
Treat it as morally urgent, not just say it.
Right. Yeah, right. So, well, this gets us to like this sensitive subject of UBI, Universal Basic Income. Since some people are going to fall through the cracks, don't we have a moral obligation to have some kind of social safety net? Social spending has to be at a certain level. It's about 22%, I think, for the United States now, 22% of GDP on all social spending. Canada is slightly lower, actually. Most European countries are in the 20 to 22% of GDP range. That almost seems like an inevitable law of nature of Western democracies and where they end up because of the inequities that capitalism seems to have built into it.
Well, most social spending goes to the elderly. Some of that is highly valuable. Not all of it is. I think our welfare program that works best is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which in essence pays people to work more, pays them to work. I'm a bigger fan of that than I am of universal basic income. I think people crave work. They thrive in a workplace environment. It gives them social networks and validation. It keeps them involved, gives them a greater sense of purpose. So the idea that the social symbolism is to pay people not to work at all, unless they're disabled, in general, I'm quite skeptical. And the real impact of UBI would mean people would vote to keep out immigrants, and we would do the world as a whole much less good. So I say no UBI. Let's improve our current welfare institutions when we can.
Did you like the Clinton reforms where you have to get back to work after a certain period of time of being on welfare?
Yes, those were positive in my view. I think now we could do a lot to improve Medicaid. The idea that it's half the states, basically half federal, both parties shirk a bit and it could be a higher quality program.
Right.
We're much more interested in, sending money to the elderly because they vote at high rates. That to me is inefficient. We should spend less on the old and more on the young. That's what would maximize growth. We're doing the opposite.
Right. Are you worried?
It's a bipartisan thing. You might think, one party's better than the other, but believe me, both parties are united in this over time.
Yeah, I don't think that's ever going to change. There might be little tweaks to the system here and there, but well, you and I are both baby boomers, so we're about to hit the wall in the next 20 years. Are you worried about Social Security running out? I've been reading this since I think I was in college. The whole thing's a pyramid scheme, and it's all going to run out. And yet I can't imagine the government allowing it to run out. There'd just be some new system of taxation to support it.
I don't think it will run out. I do think benefits will be means tested more. So you and I may not receive what we were hoping to receive. I'm not counting on it in any significant way. Taxes for it will go up. It will become a more complicated and worse system. But the idea that it's just all going to disappear, I think, is extremely unlikely.
Yeah, that seems to come from more conspiratorial, apocalyptic-minded people. Pinker, he got pushed back as well for this idea of being too optimistic, and you say the world's getting a better place, but becoming a better place. But what about that person over there or this group over there that's suffering, or the opioid crisis, or suicide rates are up in this pocket over here, blacks are more incarcerated? How do you deal with all the counterexamples to the kind of, I wouldn't call it optimism so much as realism that your book presents?
Well, most of them I think we can at least partially fix. So the number of people we incarcerate, that takes some time to fix, but we can fix it. Addictions are a serious problem. But if you look at how the opioid crisis snuck up on us, it seems we did many things wrong with not tracking multiple prescriptions, not having the right databases, not taking the problem seriously at first. I'm not saying there's a magic wand where it all goes away overnight, but until, say, 2 years ago, no one even talked about what we should do to prevent this. So it's hard to believe we're at an optimum now. I'm a strong believer, like most people, just shouldn't drink alcohol, shouldn't take any drugs as a voluntary choice. I'd like to see that as a stronger social movement, a bit like vegetarianism. I think Mormons are basically totally correct on those issues, and we should follow their lead.
You mean for health reasons or for moral reasons, or both?
Well, both. So if you think of 10 to 20% of people will abuse alcohol, and the others will not, right? They drink fairly responsibly. But nonetheless, say 15% abusing it is a pretty significant percentage. And if alcohol is always there, socially available, socially accepted, I think it's playing with fire. That if none of us would drink, we'd have many fewer alcoholics. There wouldn't be the same kind of exposure, normalcy. Crime rates would be much lower. Incarceration rates would be lower. I'm a big advocate of this social change as a movement, voluntary.
Voluntary, yeah. So something like libertarian paternalism, that oxymoronic title of nudging people in the direction by giving them incentives. What would that be for like alcohol consumption?
Well, I'm not sure taxing alcohol would work out well because sometimes you just push people to more destructive drugs. I just think people taking the moral lead on this issue. And earlier in American history, prohibition was a big movement. I don't agree with the legal ban of prohibition, but people simply talking about the evils of alcohol was much stronger than it is today. And I think we could go back to the voluntary side of that more.
Moral suasion.
Moral suasion, including on marijuana.
I don't know what your religious beliefs are. I'm an atheist, but I presume you would.
I'm not a believer. Whether I'm atheist, agnostic, you could debate, but I don't believe.
But I'm going to guess you would recognize religion as an important social institution for enforcing norms and moral values to get people to, like the Mormons, to just be better, healthier individuals, better citizens, and so on.
That's right. I think on net it's a social benefit. I recognize it does harm many people. And some religions can be much worse for women. But still, on net, it worries me that America is secularizing and we're going to church less.
It does?
It does.
Oh.
I think it enforces good behavior. It encourages people to have more children. That means more creators, more innovators, more growth of our society, more spread of our values. I'm all for that.
Oh my God, you're like Julian Simon in his debates with Paul Ehrlich.
I knew Julian when I was like 19. I corresponded with him. It was a big influence on me.
You did?
And he was right.
Yeah.
Yes.
He won those bets.
What?
He won those bets against Paul Ehrlich.
Yes, he would not have won them, if you compared across every year. But I still think he was more right than wrong.
Including on overpopulation.
On that, he was completely right. On some of the minerals prices, he happened to luck out what years they picked for the end years of the bet.
Right. But his more general argument that more people is more creators, more brains thinking about how to solve problems. Obviously, you don't want 1 trillion people on Earth, but it's okay to have a few million more or a few hundred million more. In this case, I guess a few billion more. Where do you put the upper ceiling?
It's quite empty. It's not overpopulated.
Yes.
The second largest city in the country is 400,000 people. So they're lacking in infrastructure and economies of scale. And Ethiopia probably ought to have a lot more people. Right.
Yes, well, environmentalists, they don't seem to get that argument. It's more of an economic argument than, say, a resources available argument.
I think most environmental indicators are getting better. I know that's not true for carbon emissions. We do have ways we can try to address that problem. But just having fewer people seems to me a highly inefficient way of solving any problem. Like, let's say you think there's too much depression in the world, and your only recipe is, well, let's not have people. Right? Or like, let's have 10 people, then hardly anyone will be depressed. That has to be wrong and inefficient.
Right.
Same with carbon emissions. There's better ways.
Right. Yeah, these are, in many ways, economic solutions to social problems. Back to I watched your TED talk on, when I was on stories, you did another talk on incentives. Yeah. We'll come back to the stories because toward the end, because that's, I think, the bigger picture. We all have to tell a better story. If you want to sell your ideas, you got to be a good storyteller. Well, maybe
Yes.
we could talk about that now. I mean, I've become friends with Jordan Peterson recently, and that's his whole thing. Stories are everything. Mythology, archetypes. You got to. The problem is the world is very chaotic, and you got to impose order on it. Not just you personally, but we as intellectuals or politicians that are organizing society, economists that are offering policy. You got to sell it in a particular way. Here's our story, and you have a story.
The mythological element. And Jordan both saw the importance of mythology and narrative and the importance of YouTube, like at the same time. And he made this brilliant push that's made him, maybe right now the most influential public intellectual.
Do you have an opinion on him? Everybody asks everybody about this these days.
Well, there's so much to Jordan. I'm interviewing him myself in about 2 weeks' time.
Oh, good.
I think he's definitely a net social positive. But he does say a lot of things that to me seem designed to provoke for the sake of provocation. And that's not really my temperament or what I prefer. So I'm made uneasy by some of his pronouncements, even if I might agree with them. And I think he too much paints a story of like good guys and bad guys, and here are these villains, and all your free speech is going away. And I'm more optimistic than that. I live in universities, like I do see what he's talking about. I don't dismiss it at all. But I think there's a bit too much doom and gloom in there.
Yes, I think the application of your TED Talk idea of beware of stories that are very simple with a good guy and a bad guy, and one of these super simple plots. There's only 7 plots or whatever it is. I have to say I have been susceptible to that myself in my early years. Like in college, I went through my obligatory Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, objectivist phase, and then sort of anarcho-capitalist phase, and then radical libertarian, and then libertarian and classical liberal. I've kind of shifted to recognizing not just the political philosophy, but how complex the world is and how many different elements have to come together to shift it just a little bit. But the idea, we just have this one idea, that's all you need, this is going to fix the world's problems, that seems very naive.
But if we're like eclectic and deeply curious and take the best from all traditions and hold science in high regard, I think we'll get to wherever it is it turns out we need to be as a species.
Why do you think, what's the appeal of Ayn Rand and particularly Atlas Shrugged and her objectivist philosophy?
Well, a lot of the content is brilliant, I think. So my favorite book by her is Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which is nonfiction. To me, Atlas Shrugged is just way too long and unwieldy. But the way she understands like the moral virtue of producing and of capitalism, I think is far more right than wrong. So I don't consider myself a Randian or objectivist or that I ever have been one. But her main idea in the practical realm is correct. And at least some of her appeal comes from being right. I think we should acknowledge that. Now, her critique of altruism, I think, is totally wrong. Her very detailed set of claims about philosophy, I think, are either mostly wrong or just under-argued or like not mature enough philosophically. But on the key issue, is capitalism the most moral system? I think she's right. I don't think she's right that laissez-faire is like stable, but I give her credit.
Well, that is kind of the theme of stubborn attachments, is that there is both economics and morality are tightly integrated. You really can't separate them.
And production is this key point where they come together. Things have to be produced. It's not all just about distribution. My goodness, if only my Twitter feed would see that more often, I'd feel better.
But explain, because most people don't think about production as a moral issue or capitalism as a moral system. How is it moral? Where does the morality come in?
People produce to express their desire to do something for the world, to express their desire to earn income for themselves, provide for their families. Those two forces come together in what to me is a deeply moral activity. Making something. I'm not saying all production is good. Some production can be destructive. There are people who make terrible weapons. I get all those exceptions. But production as a whole is so much of the source of value in human history. You compare lives before the Industrial Revolution to lives after it, and you ask, what's the difference? Why is life expectancy not 30 or 40 years anymore? And it's all about production. Rand got that. Mises got that. People today, somewhat they're forgetting it. But again, their insistence that government can do no good, whatever, I think that's wrong. And, we need to move beyond that and be more eclectic.
Yeah, it's too simple of a story. One of my best friends is a guy named Michael Coles. He founded the Great American Chocolate Chip Cookie Company, which he ultimately sold for, I don't know, $30, $40 million. And, he's got a comfortable life. He's very generous with his money for supporting charities and so on. But he made cookies, and everybody kind of they feel good about that. Like, yeah, making cookies, that's a good thing. But when you see somebody like a Wall Street trader that's just moving digits around on a screen and he's making $30, $40 million a year or something, somehow that just doesn't feel the same.
Well, keep in mind, these traders, they're not very wasteful. They're not consuming a lot of resources. And a lot of what they're making from other traders. So it's like people betting on horse races. Is it somewhat wasteful? Some of it. Are they destroying much value? Not really. Are they impoverishing other people? Not really. So I think a lot of finance allocates capital more efficiently. A lot of finance does not. It's just shuffling paper back and forth, and it's like betting. The betting side of finance, in most circumstances, there are exceptions, but usually it's not actually very destructive.
Another argument I have in my own head, trying to recognize the other side from my more libertarian tendencies, is as I've gotten older, or let's say over the last 30 years, my stock portfolio has grown simply because I just, I buy stocks every chance I get. And cumulatively, it grows and grows, and I do the dividend reinvestment and all that.
Yeah, I do too. I never sell them.
Never sell them.
Yeah.
So let's say, before I had, 10 shares of Apple, then I had 100 shares of Apple, now I have 1,000 shares of Apple. So when Apple goes up $10, I'm making way more now with my 1,000 shares than I did with my 10 shares. But there are people that have 1,000,000 shares of Apple. That guy who has 1,000,000 shares of Apple, he didn't do any more work than I did. He wasn't any more productive. He had put no more labor into the profit he made that's so much greater than mine. How is that not immoral?
I think you've got to give higher rewards to people who make better guesses. And some of those better guessers, they are just lucky, right? Sometimes it's skill, sometimes it's luck. But I can't imagine a well-functioning system that's going to differentiate the skill from the luck. And I'm willing to reward both. And in part, it's why we have iPhones, right? To think that, it's only about 10 years old, and it's like knit together the whole world. All the information that can be recorded is at your fingertips, more or less 24/7, even if you go, say, to Africa. It's so astonishing. And our world did all that in 10 years. And if people get rewarded for it, and some of them were like lucky duckies, I say bring it on.
Right. That's a good response. And then related to that, we've seen an increase in the gap between average worker pay versus average CEO pay. And it was like 350 times now. It used to be like 20 times. And my friend John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, former CEO, now he got bought out by Amazon, he set the Whole Foods gap between himself and the average worker at 19 times. And he calls that conscious capitalism. Like, we need to make this more moral. But why is it more moral to make 19 times more than the average worker than, say, 350 times more?
I think CEO pay has gone up because the job of a CEO has become harder. It's much more about the law, much more about communications, public relations, managing government, maybe managing a global supply chain. The number of people who can do those things is much fewer than the old style CEO who was just someone like promoted within the ranks of a company. So it's a question of supply and demand. Basically, CEO pay is determined by equity holdings and options, not salaries. And if the company's worth more, they earn more. So if a lot of companies are worth more and their CEOs are earning more and not that many people can do those jobs, I personally don't find that immoral. I agree there are particular companies, plenty of them, that have overpaid particular people. But the system as a whole, it's amazing how much CEO pay goes up in lockstep with equity markets.
I think there's a selection bias going on here, too. We hear about the CEOs that make so much money and the company's profit. We don't hear about the ones that the company's invested in and they flopped. The guy was a loser and they lost money. You just don't hear about those.
Right. Think of it as like, star athletes, basketball stars. NBA teams, they pay a lot to try to get those stars, get the next LeBron James. A lot of times they make mistakes and they overpay stars. That's a natural part of the process. Are those mistakes wrong or you want to undo them? Of course. But precisely because stars are rare, a lot of people who don't quite become stars end up overpaid. And I think CEOs are very similar.
Yeah, it was pointed out to me by a person I met from a high up person at Intel when we were discussing this recently at a function with Jordan Peterson, actually. That Intel's whatever their value is every year, like $70 billion a year they make. Whether you pay the CEO $20 million a year or $50 million, it's irrelevant. It's trivial. It doesn't matter. And if you don't pay him, somebody else is going to grab him.
Of course. And you want the returns tied to equity. And if equity values go up, so will CEO returns. Right. So I'm fine with the system.
Right. All right, let's move on here. This is covering some valuable ideas here. Chapter 5, why eat an ice cream cone when someone in Malawi is starving? That's one version of an age-old question in ethics, yet it remains difficult to answer. Here I was thinking of Peter Singer's famous thought experiment where, if you're walking along a path and you're wearing $500 boots and a kid falls in the pond next to you and is drowning, would you go in there, ruin your $500 boots to save the kid? Everybody says, well, of course I would. And so he says, okay, well, there's somebody starving in Africa who could use the $500 that you are now wearing on that you're about to spend at the boot company. So don't send the money to charity.
Overall, I think we do the most for Africa or other poorer parts of the world by being productive and innovative and buying their products and producing antibiotics and vaccines and smartphones. But still, at the margin, individuals with some income, I think, should be more charitable. I tried to live that philosophy with this book by donating all the funds to this family in Ethiopia. There are several families in Mexico I've supported for 20 years by sending them substantial amounts of cash. So we should do more at the margin. I'm a big believer in that. If you try to live a life of poverty and give away everything you have, we won't be the United States anymore. That would be a big mistake. So you don't want to level the playing field, but yes, we should be more charitable.
Yeah, I admit religions are pretty good at that, and a lot of atheists and humanists I know, secular humanists, kind of wring their hands about that a little bit. Like we need to do more of that because yes. Atheists and humanists are sort of branded as amoral or immoral or just not as good a people as religious people. So one of our responses is, okay, we're going to get out there and do more for charity or giving or whatever. And I think it was David Brooks's book showed that religious people give more blood, they donate more hours, and so on. And so what's your recommendation for like a more secular or maybe government-sponsored paternalistic incentives to people to give more when their religions are not doing it or they're not religious?
Just do it. Don't wait for the government. It will take them forever. There is some foreign aid. I'm not sure how effective it is. I don't think it's going to go up a lot in magnitude anytime soon. So you as an individual, what I did is I flew to Mexico. Through the course of doing other things, I met some poor families, became friendly with them, decided they were responsible enough to handle some extra money, and I've been supporting several families now, like I said, for 20 years. And maybe you don't speak Spanish, there's other places you can go, but you can do it. I'm not saying the poorest Americans can, but if you're upper middle class or better off, you can do it now. Buy a plane ticket, figure out a place to go, exercise some judgment in who will get your money, just common sense.
Right.
And it's fun too. It's highly rewarding. I don't think it runs counter to being selfish, actually.
No, I think it's in a way it's a selfish thing to do because you feel better about yourself.
Right.
And if you want to argue it from a purely Darwinian perspective, it's a way of signaling to other people, even if you're doing it privately, you yourself act differently as a more generous person, signaling to other people that you are a good person, you are a generous person, they can count on you.
And most people, they spend a lot of money on, what I would call junk. That's up to them. It's their choice. I would just say, think about everything you buy. Do you really need it? Maybe you can help out the world some more instead.
But of course, sacrificing goods for your own family, just the basics, that would not be productive because then in the long run, you're not as productive.
Yes, I do find it striking that poorer Americans give away a higher percentage of their income than richer Americans. And I think that's a kind of disgrace to richer Americans, but bravo to the poor. That's real sacrifice, right?
What is the reason for that gap, do you think?
I suspect it's religion. And keep in mind, some of the poor families giving away money, they may also be purchasing social insurance. So if you give to your church for 10 years and then you fall on hard times and the church supports you, like maybe it wasn't pure altruism all along, but I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah, whatever works. Yeah.
Yeah, wealthy don't need to do that, and they just let time pass, and they don't give away very much, a lot of them.
Right.
Or they construct these big bureaucracies that just like hire staff, and a lot of their money is eaten up by overhead.
Right. Yeah, that's why I like Peter Singer's, I forget the effective giving, or I forget what it's called, but they've kind of screened out the charities where there's a lot of waste and posted the charities on their webpage that the money is most directly given to the people that really need it.
I would stress that's not always easy to do, but still, we need to do more of that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay, chapter 6 here. When I was a kid, I loved science fiction stories. I loved to think about how things could be totally different from the way they were. One story in particular intrigued me, and I encountered its premise in a few different books. It still appears in popular culture, and if you don't like science fiction, try the 1998 movie Sliding Doors, starring Gwyneth Paltrow, which asks how much a single life can be altered by the simple act of missing a train. So here you have this balance between the role of chance and contingency and accident versus sort of the rule of law and major large forces that are pushing you along, and there's not much you could do. You seem to err a little bit on the side of the role of contingency and chance of having quite an effect in our lives.
You can't eliminate chance or contingency. When you try to help other people, there's always the possibility it ends up harming them. When you're pushing for a policy, it can backfire. It can not work out the way you thought. So I think, again, we should push for what we think is right, but be epistemically modest, be tolerant of others, not polarize debate in terms of how we proceed, and be open to the fact that even when we're doing our very best, it may not work out the way we want it. I think that's a healthy attitude to have.
Right. Conclusion. Some of my arguments have concerned the theme of distance. I have claimed that the inhabitants of the future are less distant from us in moral terms than many other views would indicate. Therefore, we should take more seriously the implications of our choices for that future. Right. So here's another economic argument about discounting the future versus not, or to what extent do we owe future generations a livable earth or sustainable ecosystems and so on.
Well, I'm not sure what the word owe means. I just think it would be better if we did it. So again, most environmental indicators improve with economic growth. So us doing the selfish thing and building good institutions helps the future in most cases. I think there are a few areas where that doesn't follow. The most obvious would be climate change, global warming. And there we do have a lot of options. Electric cars, solar power, wind power are turning out to be more feasible than we thought. I've long been a big fan of doing more with nuclear power. It's basically completely green. We simply need to do it so we can have a high growth society which is carbon friendly. We're not on that track right now. I understand that. And other countries, of course, are a big problem, right? We can't tell Vietnam what to do. Nonetheless, we can set a good example, and we've been big polluters in the past.
I'm 100% with you on nuclear, but the pushback I always get is, well, what about the waste and the potential for catastrophic disaster?
Well, there's been some catastrophic disasters, but they're not nearly as bad as what people tell us climate change will be like. I'm not an expert in this area, but if the pessimists about climate change are right, they should be willing to live with these other problems. They seem much less serious. Also, nuclear power just leads to less air pollution. And forget about carbon, just plain flat out air pollution, according to the WHO, kills 7 million people a year, like now, every year.
Right.
Like, can't we do more to stop that? You barely hear about that. That's an awful tragedy.
That's right. And no one's died due to nuclear power in the United States.
Right. So, okay, if every, 40 years there's a Chernobyl or Fukushima, I mean, those are terrible events. Let's do more with safety. But still, compare that to 7 million people dying a year, plus the long-run impact of climate change. Seems to me like a no-brainer. Again, not being an expert, but I think we're just unwilling to do it.
Yeah. Since I have an economist here, I have to ask you about Trump and trade and tariffs. Is he right that we're getting screwed by China in these trade deals like NAFTA or TPP, and that he's on the right track of protecting American interests? Or are we all really going to be richer without his tariff system, and we should go back to the old way we've been doing things?
Trump doesn't understand trade. Trump's rhetoric is terrible. But that said, Trump renegotiated NAFTA. The New Deal is fine. I give him credit for that. It's not an improvement. He's just lying there, but let's sign it. The problem there is the Democrats. China is really about geopolitics. U.S. trade with China is good for both nations. But the people who say China is ripping off American companies, doing industrial espionage on a massive scale, conducting IP violations, violating property rights, planting spies in major companies, all that is true. And it's very bad. I don't know that tariffs are the answer. But if someone like Trump says we need to strike back in some way, I do take that seriously. But don't confuse that with the economics of thinking tariffs are good for America. They're not. They're not good for our economy. But I do think there is a China problem, and we need to think long and hard about how to fix it. And so far, I haven't seen that anyone has the answer.
So a tariff on imported goods from China, or say Apple making iPhones in China and then bringing them here, they're just going to be passed on to consumers, right? It's not like Apple's going to take a bite out of its profit every year.
Well, I think some of it is borne by consumers, but some of it is borne by Apple, and some of it is borne by the country where the final assembly takes place. So you could imagine in the future Apple switching, say from China to Vietnam, and then you have a loss borne by China. So the incidence of a tariff is complex. But keep in mind, you put tariffs on one set of goods, then other people put tariffs on you. It's very unlikely you're going to end up better off, even if you can get Apple to pay some of the bill. Apple probably does pay some of the bill.
Right. Last two big questions, since your talk on stories, your TED talk on stories, I found so interesting. If you were to advise Democrats for 2020, or say anybody in 2024, about a better story or better narrative than the one Trump sold. Obviously, the story Trump sold was a good story. A lot of people really liked what he had to say. And obviously, Hillary didn't have a very good story, or at least it wasn't as good as his.
Terrible story, yeah. People find hypocrisy worse than lying. So Trump lies, Hillary was a hypocrite. People resent the latter more. It's interesting. But, I would say to the Democrats, pick an honest candidate. Don't be afraid to be boring. Go with good governance. Run on the economy, healthcare, jobs, and good wages, and greater reliability on foreign policy. Maybe pick someone from the Midwest and really just focus on winning, not like your favorite, left-wing idea being in the platform and all that. We need centrist governance and good governance, and less of all this erratic unpredictability. The Democrats can give it, but if you're just getting some left-wing version of Trump or a radical, Trump's chance of winning goes up. So
right.
Let's get it right this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think is the appeal of Trump to like a coal miner in Kentucky or West Virginia or whatever, who's a little guy? He's never going to be a wealthy billionaire living in New York City. Why does he look at Trump and go, I like this guy?
There's a snobby professional class in this country. I suppose you and I belong to it. We talk in particular ways. We know what it means to be politically correct. We adhere to certain norms. I'm not saying you and I look down on these other people, but like our class as a whole does. And these other people resent it, and then they see Trump as one of them, and he tells the truth, and he fights against political correctness, and he says what he thinks, which he sort of does, even though he lies. And I get why they enjoy it. Like, if I see, like, Trump own the libs, like, sometimes for me, I think, like, wow, this is great, even though I don't at all like what Trump is standing for. But there's a kind of comeuppance that's being acted out, and it has a real appeal. And a lot of the fault of that, like, is ours, collectively viewed.
It's kind of a fuck you vote.
Yeah. And we're learning how important, Brexit also. The Leave voters didn't have some complex theory of how to write the best deal. They had no idea what they were doing. But a sense of, well, the elites are screwing us over. They're so self-righteous. Here's our one chance to, like, jab them in the eye. And my goodness, they did it. And now Brexit's a mess. No one knows what to do next.
Right. Well, they just had that vote today. Doesn't look like it's going to happen.
200 and something vote margin. Incredible.
Yeah, unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So my next big project, maybe, I'm not 100% sure on this, governing Mars. Okay, we're about to colonize Mars, if not this decade, then certainly this century. So we're going to import from America, from whatever, from the Earth to the red planet, some kind of political and economic system by which the people there will live. And let's carry this science fiction story out so that you like science fiction. A century from now, 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now, probably there'll be a different species or whatever, but they'll still be hominids. They'll be, Homo sapiens, essentially.
Yeah.
What system should we take with us? What should we leave behind? What have we learned?
Well, why don't we start with theocracy? That's how the New World was settled. So I would send Mormons, encourage them to stay Mormons, have a lot of children, have a strict morality. It's a highly cooperative society overall, and there's tithing and a social insurance network. And it's part of Mormon doctrine that, mankind is destined to settle other planets, so they would really believe in what they're doing. So I say step one is send Mormons and encourage them to be Mormons.
My atheist friends are not going to like to hear this.
Good.
You are a heterodox thinker as a secularist. What about economically? I mean, if you have 100 people like that act like yeah, I mean, if you had 1,000 people living on Mars, and then 10,000, then 100,000, then 1,000,000, should they be essentially close to what we have, a kind of a free market, or at least fair free market?
Well, I would do a free market. You're not going to have the personnel or capacity to regulate so many things, right? But the thing that's tricky on a Mars colony, I would think the level of surveillance is very, very high. Like you can't just run around outside. So if everything is surveilled, whether it's private or public sector, I worry about how to regulate that, how to use it. I don't think we on planet Earth are solving that problem very well. So I'd say yes, like a lot of unregulated capitalism on Mars, I'm all for it. But the real deeper question is how to deal with the extreme level of powerful surveillance you'll have. And I don't know.
Yeah, the problem here is it's not like Europeans coming to North America where they have all the free, it's not like coming to North America where you have all the free food and all right, my dog's going crazy. And you can
just exit. You don't like the Puritan rule. You move to Ohio.
That's right. You can't just walk out of your containment unit on Mars and go off to the forest. Whoever controls the oxygen and the water and the food production, I suppose, that could be a dangerous monopoly, essentially a tyranny on Mars. I could see happening.
All the more reason to send Mormons, right?
They're less likely to do that.
Well, they seem, on average, less corruptible.
Surely,
I'm not saying there'd be no problem, but if you had to choose.
But let's just take one example. Who controls the production of oxygen, on which everybody survives? So you have one central authority that we all vote on or try to control, or do you have 100 different oxygen production companies and they compete with each other? So we don't worry about any one of them saying, I'm not giving you any more oxygen unless you do X. You'll just say, well, I'll take my service over to the other oxygen producer.
I suspect there's a common piping system of some kind and you're stuck with monopoly. So I want Facebook or Google or someone to run the oxygen supply, internalize the externalities, and keep the oxygen flowing to maximize profits. I don't even know what other choice we're going to have. Probably a lot of these things will be done by companies, whether we like it or not.
SpaceX, Google X.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, are you worried about the government swooping in to start regulating the social media companies, or do you think they can do it themselves?
I am. Yeah. I mean, they've screwed up in some bad ways, but government would do a much worse job. And, if you don't like Facebook, you don't actually have to be on it. I have an account, but I don't use it. My life is just fine. Young people are off Facebook more and more. So I would leave them alone.
Let the market solve it.
For useful products that are worth more than the privacy you lose, great. If they don't, let them be.
I agree. YouTube has become very censorious. I often wonder why there aren't
employees getting upset, right?
Yeah. Why aren't there 6 YouTubes?
They should loosen up.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there could just be just another YouTube, like a Hulu, or somebody who's not censorious. It's not going to judge you based on the political statements made in your video or whatever. They just let you do whatever you want.
I don't expect that because the shareholders of Google, Alphabet / Google / YouTube, they have a fiduciary responsibility, and they kick some people off so as to keep their employees happy. And another tech company is going to face the same set of issues. The people who want to replace Patreon and all that, I get why they're unhappy, but I don't think it's so easy to escape that basic logic. Those are profit-maximizing companies. They do what they're doing for a reason.
Right. So
I don't like it.
Yeah, right. So the solution is competition. Just have more choices.
Well, but if all the choices do the same thing to maximize profit, does it really help?
Okay, all right, right. So there you're back to having some kind of central government or regulatory agency.
I just wish people would have less of a busybody attitude and say, look, what you're doing or saying is totally offensive, but you're on this platform. I'm just going to ignore it. We need to all grow up a bit. I don't think competition itself is going to solve the problem. There are some natural monopoly elements. Like YouTube is way bigger than number 2 in that sector. Facebook is way bigger. Like, could you even name number 2? Well, Instagram. Who owns Instagram?
Yeah. Right. How do economists think about monopolies? The average person thinks they're dangerous and bad. Why are they not dangerous and bad?
These are zero price monopolies, right? They're not restricting output. They're giving away everything for free. So maybe we economists are a little confused.
Oh, okay.
But I would say it's mostly a beneficial arrangement. There's no big plan out there at Facebook or Google to start charging us $1 million to access the service. But it does mean they have more discretionary power than is ideal. And we need to get used to the fact they might make mistakes or mistakes of omission. They may not take down, some neo-Nazi or whatever. And just to realize, Nazi works have been out there a long time. They're terrible. They're evil. You can buy Hitler's Mein Kampf on Amazon and no one freaks out over that. It's at the public library.
Right.
You argue against these things by being virtuous and arguing against them, not by just trying to make a company censor them.
Yeah. Dennis Prager just sued Google / YouTube yesterday in California court. Do you know Dennis Prager, the conservative radio talk show host?
He is. I've never met him.
Well, he's got this online series, Prager University, of short videos. They're like 5 minutes long. They're well produced. And, he's got a huge following. They get, millions of views. But Google / YouTube started demonetizing some and restricting access to others that had conservative points of view in schools and libraries and things like that. So that's what he's suing him for. There's 5 different things, suppression of speech, and California law that requires you can't regulate, control some businesses or discriminate against some businesses more than others, and so on.
I would have to know more about the facts, but ideally I would like us to rely more on private sector solutions than lawsuits.
Yeah. Yep. Well, it's hard to say how that'll turn out. Again, why do you need to be on social media and have access to these? There's so many choices out there. But you and I are a little bit older. Maybe, somebody is 20, they feel differently. Like, I need my Facebook or something. And
right. But I think, all of this has happened so quickly with social media. The norms have not caught up with the technologies. And
right.
The idea that you can be a person who rejects these things and still a normal human being, I do think we'll get there. But it may take another 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, by then, who knows what'll be online and what new companies will have popped up. I remember when the State Department sued Microsoft as a monopoly for, I think it was enforced bundling of Netscape to the exclusion of other web browsers, and by the time that was settled, Netscape was irrelevant.
Yes.
So
the law is a blunt instrument, and it's slower than technology. You have lawsuits against IBM earlier for being the dominant player. Come on, they became a minor player pretty rapidly. And then Microsoft, maybe next it will be Facebook. I think we've already seen peak Facebook. So just the 2 words chill out are a little underrated in this sector.
Yeah.
When people look at these companies.
Yeah, I've heard kids, I don't know, teenagers roll their eyes when I mention Facebook, like, I know what the coolest thing is. And they're like, dude, you have no idea. No one does Facebook anymore. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So rapid change. Yes. Well, Tyler, thank you so much. We've been going for over an hour here. The book,
Pleasure.
the new book is Stubborn Attachments. It's really an enjoyable read and nice and short and tight, which is also nice. And it's on audio, which is how I first heard it. The reader is quite good. And the proceeds all go to this person you're supporting in Ethiopia, which is really nice to see you do that. I love the cover, by the way, the little marble earth, which is kind of cool.
Dry press is great, yeah.
Yeah, they're very good. What are you working on now? What's the next big book project?
A book on big business, which is coming out later this year. It's actually finished. And it's the defense of American big business for the most part, but a pragmatic defense.
Oh, current or historical or both?
Mostly current, a bit of history, but 90% current. And I talk about the tech companies and finance, some of the themes we've hit on. That will be out in April.
Oh, good. Oh, wow, this April. Wow, who's the publisher?
This April, yes. So I've been busy, in the good sense, I hope.
Yeah, I hope so. And people can access it's Marginal Revolution is where your blog, and you also have videos on there. I saw some of those short tutorials you have that are really good.
Yes.
Basic economic policy, which are really worth watching because you don't have to sit through a 50-minute lecture. You can get it in 5 minutes.
And my podcast is Conversations with Tyler.
Yeah, that's a good title. All right,
Tyler.
Tyler.
Soon we'll be joining Peterson. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.